Demonstration Center in Orlando. I'm also a clinical instructor in the UCF Communication Sciences and Disorders program. I'm also a licensed speech language pathologist and assistive technology professional, so I spend a good amount of time working directly with funding for AAC systems. So today we're going to review briefly what AAC is, what types of things might be eligible for funding, the types of people who might benefit from or use AAC systems, and then what some of the most common funding sources are that I see and what their requirements are in order to be successful with your funding. This quote on the screen, AAC incorporates the individual's full communication abilities and may include any existing speech or vocalizations, gestures, manual signs, and aided communication, is from the National Joint Committee for the Communication Needs of Persons with Severe Disabilities. I'm including that because I wanted to acknowledge that AAC systems are inclusive of a lot of different methods and modalities. For funding purposes, we're not going to go in depth into all of them because some aspects don't require funding or require that type of process. But when speaking of someone's AAC system, it should be inclusive of all of their methods of communication. The next slide has a photo of a child doing a modified sign for more. And we're talking about augmentative and alternative communication. So the augmentative part, meaning someone could be verbal or partially verbal, but not be able to communicate effectively in all situations or with all of their partners, thus requiring some form of aided communication some of the time. Or a system could be an alternative mode where it is the predominant or primary communication system that a person uses. And those AAC systems could be temporary, so sometimes they follow a procedure where someone's not able to voice or write or type with their hands. Some children need an AAC system during childhood, but grow out of it when their speech skills develop to the point that they meet their functional communication needs. An AAC system could also be permanent. There are a variety of reasons, cognitive, linguistic, or motoric, that a person may not be able to meet their needs through speech, in which case an AAC system may be something they use throughout their lifespan. AAC could include something that is no tech, so we call those unaided, or aided, using some other type of equipment to communicate with. It may use symbols. I think a lot of people think of AAC systems as symbol-based, but it would also be inclusive of text-based systems, so traditional orthography or keyboards using print. And AAC systems use a range of access, so this could be anything from touching something directly all the way up through things that utilize head tracking or eye gaze. Now, unaided communication, rather, are those things that don't require any outside support, so gestures, facial expressions, sign language. And again, while we're focused on funding today, we're really not going to be talking about those, but they are very much valid forms of communication. Aided communication is anything that requires an external support, so picture, symbols, communication books or board, or some sort of tablet or computer with voice output. And those systems can be further broken down into different categories. So low-tech systems, this screen has a picture of a couple of options. The top left is showing a low-tech eye gaze frame. So the one pictured here is made out of kind of an acrylic material with some letters and locations, and the person looks at the box that holds the letter that they want to communicate. The top right picture, those are different POD books. The main feature to note here, POD is a very extensive system with a lot of options, but I liked this photo because you can see the different types of binding and spirals that are used, things that fold out, so different types of materials were involved in creating those systems. And then the system on the bottom is a traditional PECS book. So color-coded sheets that have Velcro strips with the symbols attached. And then the bottom orange strip, you can arrange the icons that you want to communicate, rip it off and hand it to someone. If you think about cost in creating these systems, there are some tangible items involved. So examples here include the frame itself, some sort of binder or book. You might need a software program in order to utilize or create something with those symbols. And then all of these use some form of paper, laminate, some cutting, things like that. So relatively low cost items, but definitely some costs involved in their creation. I recently made a low-tech eye gaze frame. I went to like a Lowe's. I think I spent $12 or $13, and I was able to make 2 low-tech eye gaze frames with that. So they don't have to be high-cost items, but there is a charge involved. Mid-tech systems, these are the systems that now have voice output, but it's all digital recordings. So I literally record the word or phrase for each button that I select. There's 2 examples here. The 32 message communicator on the left side of the screen. So that's a black device split into 32 cells with symbols on each. And every one of those 32 buttons, if you select it, it'll have a different recorded message. And that system is $425.95. The one on the right is a GoTalk 20. So that is a green plastic case, and it has 20 locations for icons to be put in, and then the message is recorded on top. And that system is $249. So these were just to show there's a range in what you can get. There's single recordable buttons all the way up to things with levels that you change out. And so in looking at that, the cost similarly varies. And these are some of the high-tech displays that are out there. There's quite a few. iPads and iPad minis, of course, can be a high-tech communication system with the appropriate software added to them. The ProSlate underneath, there are companies now that will take iPads and turn them into what's called a dedicated system. So it essentially only runs that app. That's in order to meet insurance standards. We're going to talk about those in a minute. There's also Android tablets. Not all AAC apps are available on Android. A lot of it has to do with support and costs for the developer, but some are. And then underneath that are the dedicated tablets. And so these are ones that are made specifically to comply with insurance standards. They are often funded through insurance. There's 2 examples on this slide. The top one on the right is the Accent 1000 from PRC. That would retail for $7,295. The one below that, the NovaChat 10, would retail for $3,995. So who benefits from these types of products? It's a range of people. It's really anyone who doesn't meet their functional communication needs across environments and with a range of communication partners. That could be due to a congenital condition, something from birth, like autism, Down syndrome, or cerebral palsy. It could be acquired, something like a brain injury or a stroke. It could also be an intellectual disability that results in impaired communication, or sometimes a hearing impairment. If you were talking about insurance in particular, these types of underlying causes can become relevant. There are insurances that fund things for certain diagnoses and not others. So it becomes more relevant for that. But from a theoretical standpoint, any person who isn't meeting their needs would benefit. There are a lot of ways AAC systems can be funded. Obviously, a person can purchase them using their own private funding at any time. That has very little barrier most of the time. You can go directly through many of the vendors and work with them to purchase it. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about that. The questions I get are typically about using your insurance to purchase it. That's probably the most common method of purchase of AAC, or at least questions that I get. The next most common, if you are working with someone or have a family member who is between the ages of 3 and 21, would be public school funding. So we'll talk a bit about what that process looks like and what those requirements are. And then after that, we get into some alternate styles of funding. So there are grants that are available and loans that are available. I have heard of people doing things like GoFundMe accounts or working with their local church or community group. Again, there are other options out there. We're just going to focus for time purposes on the most common ways these things are funded. This next slide, we're going to be talking about insurance, and on the left is a photograph from the Florida Medicaid Durable Medical Equipment Handbook. When we talk about insurance funding for AAC, AAC systems can be covered by many providers as durable medical equipment, or DME. So the same way that they might cover things like wheelchairs or glasses or apnea machines, things like that, many insurances will have a category for AAC included in their DME coverage. For insurance purposes, they are only looking to cover things if medical necessity has been established for that equipment. So what that means is the specific recommendation for purchase has to be linked to a medical need or condition or specific medical deficit. And that's established or proven through an evaluation, and they're, for insurance, almost always required to be conducted by a licensed speech-language pathologist. It's also typically required that that evaluation occur within 6 months prior to submission. So if for some reason someone has an eval and a year goes by and then they decide to go to purchase, that might be grounds for a denial. So they're looking at a 6-month time frame, and then either a reevaluation or an addendum would need to be completed. In talking about insurance, many of them will fund what are called dedicated speech generating devices. So a dedicated, sometimes called closed system, basically means it's just going to run the AAC software. You're not going to be able to access the internet, put on other products or programs. It's just going to act as a voice prosthesis, essentially. This is the language that Florida Medicaid uses. They describe dedicated AAC systems as being specifically for a disabled population. They require prior authorization, so that's the report and the funding process we're going to talk about. Non-dedicated systems, sometimes they're called open systems, are commercially available devices such as laptop computers with special software and are not reimbursable by Medicaid. That's very similar to Medicare and many other funding sources that are not open to funding any type of commercial product that could be used for other purposes. So what that process looks like if someone's wanting to access their insurance funding, the first thing is to locate the SLP, the speech language pathologist. We're going to talk about in a moment how you can find one. Just know that any speech language pathologist is technically licensed to provide an AAC evaluation, but not all of them do. The other thing I usually tell teams if they're between ages 3 and 21 is you should notify your school team if your child attends a public school or even a private that you're having this eval, even if it is occurring outside of the school setting. There's a couple of reasons for that. The first is that any good AAC eval should really be considering all of the person's environments, and for a school-age child, that's a good chunk of their day. The other reason practically is that the paperwork that's required in Florida for Medicaid specifically requires what's called a school concurrence form. So essentially after the SLP completes the report, they send that report to the school with a copy of a school concurrence form, and the school needs to sign off that they are agreeing with the recommendation. And the school should really have that notification up front so that they're aware the process is going on and are prepared. Some schools may choose to look at something concurrently. And so if they choose to do that and are notified after your eval takes place, that may impede that timeline. And like we said, these eval reports are only good for those 6 months. The evaluation occurs with equipment. Again, it's a licensed SLP, but depending on the individual, there may be a need for other providers. So if they have complicated seating or access, you might be looking at an OT or a PT, giving some input or modifications. If it's someone with complicated behavior, you might have an ABA therapist involved, or vision specialist, audiologist, team members like that. AAC evals tend to be 1 or 2 appointments. Again, if you're working with a larger team or complex equipment that needs to come from different vendors, that could add on to that time. But typically you're looking at about 2 appointments. And then after the evaluation is completed, you're hopefully able to make some sort of recommendation. A common one might be to go to a trial period. Some insurances may actually require this. An average is common to see 1 month if they require it, but I've seen some private insurances require 2 months. Not all do, however, but you may want to participate in one anyway. The reason I say that is if insurance funds a device, they are funding it for a 5-year time span typically. So you want to make sure that what you purchase is really going to work for you or for your client in their settings. And a trial allows you to take that equipment, try it at home, work, school, wherever the person is functioning. And if it doesn't work for any reason, the trial device gets returned, and that does not impact your ability to then either reevaluate or purchase another system at another time. So that can be really helpful for a few reasons. If it's very complicated access, so something like eye gaze, for example, where someone may have a severely impaired motor system, a longer trial period might be helpful. They get extra practice working with that targeted motor skill, and it may allow for them to be more successful ultimately. Once the evaluation and/or trial are completed and you're looking to submit the paperwork, that all gets completed. So a full report, a prescription has to be completed that has to be signed off by a physician. Depending on the insurance, they may have requirements there. So Medicare, for example, would require a Medicare physician and the primary care be the one to sign off. Other insurances may or may not specify. Once all of that paperwork is gathered, it's going to go to the DME provider. So for many of those companies where it's a dedicated system, that's them. So I, as the SLP, gather this paperwork, I ship it off to that company, and they handle the submission at that point with insurance and handle the communication there. Ultimately, if it's denied for any reason, you always have the option to appeal that decision. You can provide supplemental paperwork. You can request additional information from the insurance source. The provider can request a meeting to discuss it with them. But assuming that it is funded, at that point it's gone to purchase, the equipment's going to ship from the DME provider to the AAC user, and you'll be able to start using it. And at that point, it's your system. This is kind of the general base timeline that most insurance funders will use. I did note at the bottom, there are definitely variations depending on the individual company and circumstance. The most common questions I get about insurance funding are, first of all, how do I know if my insurance will cover an AAC system? Many do, not all of them, however. So if you are not sure if that's a benefit that is covered in your plan, you can call them and ask. The main distinction here is you cannot call and say, can I get an iPad, for example, funded? It's very similar to calling your insurance and asking if they'll cover a specific medication. They will not answer that typically. So what you can do is look at the category of DME and call and ask if that's covered in your plan. So the sample I included here, HCPCS, we pronounce that HCPC, code E2510, that is the code that's used for any of those high-tech devices that you saw with the voice output and all that. I could call my insurance and say, do I have coverage for HCPC E2510? And that they can answer. So they won't tell me whether or not a specific device will be covered, but they will tell me if my plan has any options at all. That can be really helpful to do prior to starting the eval. While insurance, or what funding rather, shouldn't dictate everything, the reality is if someone does not have the means to purchase equipment, their time might be better spent on equipment that falls in a category that they have means to purchase. So who can conduct an eval? Again, for insurance, it's going to be a licensed speech language pathologist, but they may include input from other providers. I did put here, I mentioned this briefly, but while all speech language pathologists are able to provide or licensed to provide an evaluation, many do not. So a good place to search for one that does, the American Speech Language Hearing Association, or ASHA, has a ProFinder tool. You can search, and there's filter options, so you can filter it out by state, by region, and then you can pick the specialty. So in this case, AAC, and it will only show you the speech pathologists that are self-reported this as an area of expertise. Another question I get a lot is, my family member already has a device, but he doesn't like it or doesn't use it. Can we get another one? Depending on your insurance and the timing, that may or may not be an option. So the quote I have here is from Florida Medicaid. Again, Medicaid may reimburse for one dedicated AAC device system every 5 years per recipient. That is a very common standard amongst insurances. Many of them will only fund every 5 years. Within that 5-year period, they will fund for the repairs if the device is broken. If there is a catastrophic medical event, not something that was prognosticated for, but something substantial that no longer allows them to access that system, that may be grounds to look at it. But in general, they are looking at a 5-year period. So that is something I do talk to families about before going to purchase on a given system. This is not an exhaustive list, but some pros when talking about choosing funding options for a family. If you fund a system through insurance, it may fully cover it depending on your insurance, and that will include repairs. So what can happen is many devices will ship with like a 2-year warranty. And in those first 2 years, you just call the company up and say, hey, we dropped it, the screen cracked. They'll ship out a box. You put your device in the box and ship it back. They'll repair it and send it right to your house. After that 2-year period, if insurance purchased it the first time and funded it as a medical necessity, you can justify them covering the cost of your repair as an ongoing medical need. At that time, it would require a small amount of paperwork. The SLP would fill out a form documenting its continued need, and then you'd have your repair covered. That is sometimes a substantial benefit. So some families that opt to privately purchase an iPad, for example, one thing we talk about is if they break, what is the plan to have them repaired? How easy is it for them to get to a place like an Apple store? Will they be able to pay those out-of-pocket costs to ensure continuity with the system? So all things to consider. Another pro with insurance is that that user, once it's funded, they own that device. So that is not true across all funding sources, but it is in this case, and that can be a real pro if the individual is going to move or be in a different environment. That AAC system would continue to follow them. Potential cons to talk to people about, one is the lengthy process. So as compared to some other processes, insurance funding is probably the longest. Used to be longer, and some vendors in particular have done a lot to shorten, for example, wait time on getting a trial device. They may not require the insurance funding of a rental up front for things like that, but it can still be substantial and involve a good amount of time and multiple professionals' involvement. Another con are those limitations on equipment. People are often very familiar with several open systems like a tablet or an iPad, like a laptop, and insurance is not, in most cases, going to fund them. Some private insurances might, but many won't. So there is that inherent limitation. If you're looking to use your medical insurance, you would need to double check and see what types of equipment they fund as compared to those other funding sources. The next most common funding source that I've worked with is the public schools. This obviously applies to people who are school age, so typically between the ages of 3 and 21. And just like a lot of things, this is a very individualized experience or interpretation. So again, with the caveat that what I'm saying is these are general rules. I listed here some good documents if someone is interested in pursuing funding through a school. This information is outlined in the IDEA Act. And then the other two documents listed here are specific to Florida. So the Technical Assistance Paper on Assistive Technology for Students with Disabilities, as well as the Technical Assistance Paper for students with disabilities enrolled by their parents in private schools. In general, there are things that are required by law in public schools that are not always a requirement in private. It is a consideration as parents are exploring their school options. And so something to look into, they may not have to provide all of the same items that a public school would. So in terms of what the schools fund, what they call the assistive technology device, and this is a quote here that the words I added the bold text. An augmented communication device, playback device, or other device could be considered an assistive technology device for a child, depends on whether the device is used to increase, maintain, or improve the functional capabilities of a child with a disability, and whether the child's individualized education program or IEP team determines that the child needs the device in order to receive a free and appropriate public education, or FAPE. The reason I put that in bold is because that's very much stands in contrast to what we just talked about with Medicaid. So Medicaid defines, and many medical insurances, they define what equipment that qualifies and what they will or won't purchase by category or by item. The schools have the latitude to determine what equipment the child truly needs to access their education. And that is a very stark difference. Now, they do not have the same issue with justifying medical necessity either. Their sole purpose as an IEP team is to make sure the child is able to access their curriculum. And in order to meet that standard or FAPE, AT may be a requirement. And so AT in this case could mean something like an iPad, for example, if there was an app purchased, offered there that worked for that child in that environment. So we talked before about the insurance process for an AT eval. The schools work a little bit differently. And the biggest distinction is there really aren't specific requirements. The quote here, it is up to the IEP team to determine what specific processes, procedures, and data may be needed to help the student in the appropriate selection of an assistive technology device. So again, that IEP team is going to make the determination when someone initiates that eval over what information or criteria they're going to use, when they examine the educational need, what types of equipment or categories they want to look at to help meet that need. And they'll also decide what members of the team will be involved in conducting that assessment or making that determination. The one very specific and clear requirement is that an AT evaluation must be completed within 60 school days of it being initiated. So not calendar days, but school days. So again, who conducts a school-based eval? The team's going to determine that. They do specify that the student is a member of the team and should be involved in decision-making, but other possible team members that are cited, people with knowledge of the student, such as a parent, family member, or guardian. One or more persons knowledgeable in the area of curriculum, such as a general education teacher or special education teacher. My experiences in the schools, the special education teacher was almost always involved in the team, and then general education based on the child. One or more persons knowledgeable in the area of language, who's usually speech-language pathologist, and one or more persons knowledgeable in the areas of motor skills, which could be an occupational or physical therapist, again, depending on the need. IEP teams may decide to bring in people with expertise in assistive technology that are not typically members of that team. So some counties have AT teams specifically that will come out and provide evaluations. So the IEP team would make the determination that they need the eval, and they'd reach out to their district's AT team, and representatives would come out to help facilitate that. Those members may be present just for that eval, and then once it's completed, the school team would continue on with therapy, so that AT team may not become permanent members. Some districts, if they don't feel like they have that expertise in-house, may choose to contract with somebody to come in and provide that assessment. One of the biggest questions I get about assistive technology in the school is who's going to be paying for it. So if a child requires an AAC system in order to receive FAPE, that free and appropriate public education, the school is required to purchase it. There is no exception there. A family cannot be required to use their insurance to purchase those materials once it's been determined it's needed. However, they may choose to. The parent may elect to do so, and we'll talk a little bit about why somebody may or may not choose to do that. But the underscoring point here is that they are required, anything that's been determined to meet that educational need, the districts are required to provide. Districts also may not refuse AT due to lack of funds, meaning theirs. They can't say, well, we didn't have it in the budget this year. That's not a legal argument for not providing it. They are obligated to be providing those necessary materials, and again, necessary as determined by the IEP team. Now, when that equipment is purchased, if it's purchased through state education funds or through the district, it is the property of the school, and it is the school's responsibility then to maintain, repair, and provide any necessary insurance. So that is in contrast to something funded through insurance where the student owns it. If the district purchases it, it is their property. So here's some common school questions I get. What if I have a school-age child, but I want to purchase an AAC system using my insurance funds? Will the school use it? And so the answer here, like a lot of things, is that the school can choose to incorporate it if it's purchased through other means. And then again, you would be bringing that to the IEP team that would make that determination if it helps to provide those necessary features that are required for FAPE. And there are parents who do elect to do that for a variety of reasons, and that can work for them. One question is good timing I just saw in the chat, and as a good example, this is one of the most common questions I get about schools. If the school purchases an AAC child for my child, will they be able to bring it home at nights or on weekends? Again, that will have to be determined and written into the IEP. If it is not, a school can say no. So for example, your child has homework, so you need the AAC system in order to communicate and complete that assignment. That would justify its use. That can be written into the IEP. I have had teams though where they say there isn't an educational need to have it in the home, and they do not allow it to be sent there. So that it does have to be documented in that manner in order for it to occur, but it could happen. Another question that I will get is if your child breaks the device, loses it or breaks the device, will I have to pay for it? And again, no, even if the child breaks it in the middle of a behavior situation, a school cannot require that the parent purchase AT that is needed for educational goals once it's been written in that IEP. So even though it's been broken, you cannot be forced to reimburse. Now, what can happen is they could elect to look at the recommendation again and say, well, it was broken. Perhaps it's not the safest or most consistent method that's going to be appropriate for that child in the future, and that can be reevaluated. Something similar can happen with insurance, by the way. If there's too many repairs and they determine that the device is not suitable, but it cannot be forced in a school setting for the parent to pay for that replacement. And then finally, I do get asked a lot if the family moves. So the district has purchased equipment for your child and now somebody has a change in job or something, will the AAC system go with them to their next school? And again, as everything with the school, that comes from the district. They are able to decide that. They may choose to say yes and send that equipment on to another school. If they're leaving the school, it could be incorporated into transition planning, but they can also decide not to. So that is a conversation that needs to happen, and ideally as soon as possible, either if you know that you're moving, if your child's moving up to a different school, or if transition is approaching, having that conversation as early as possible is going to help facilitate that. So again, some pros and cons for public schools. The pros, as you saw, less restrictions on what can be purchased. Essentially, the school here has complete latitude within the context of an IEP and meeting that educational need to look at any technology on the market and say, this is what we think meets that need, as opposed to insurance where there are inherent limitations on what they've deemed durable medical equipment. You may, depending on how you go about this, have comparatively increased support and collaboration while in the school. There are teams that go about having their equipment purchased externally through healthcare providers and who do not allow their schools to participate in the process. And so then the school may look at it and say, we don't think that meets our needs here. And you may not have consistent use across environments. Incorporating their technology into all the recommendations, you may have more buy-in throughout the person's day. Some cons, so the obligation here in making that decision is solely educational necessity. So something could be meeting their needs to complete assignments in the school, and it may not allow them to communicate at the cash register with a medical provider, things like that. That's not necessarily within the mandate of the school. Sometimes the equipment will meet all of those needs. Obviously, that's the ideal, but it's not technically the mandate that they are operating under, whereas an insurance is looking across environments. So similarly, a con, as just discussed, it may not be available outside of school hours for that reason, unless it is stated in the IEP. I put under both pros and cons that the system is owned by the school. So again, you have a source similar to the repairs with insurance. If something happens to the equipment, the school is required to help with repairs, maintenance, things like that. That also can be a con because it is the school's property and they are able to make some decisions regarding its timing, its use, its purchase, refurbishment, things like that. So all factors to consider when looking at your funding sources. A quick note on just a couple of alternate funding options that do exist for people. One of them are grants. There are grants that exist for AAC and AT at large. The ones I see most commonly are based on age or diagnosis. The requirements or application processes for grants vary too widely to go into specific detail. What I would say is to review the process very carefully as soon as you start considering the option. Some grants will still require an evaluation. They may still want to see a report from a provider to know that someone has evaluated to make sure that it is the most appropriate equipment. Some of them may require a documentation of income level. Some of them may want to show proof of a denial from your insurance or other funding source. They have limited means, so they can determine who it is that they want to be funding at that point. The other one, there are some grants out there that will fund assistive technology, for example, but might state that they won't fund iPads. There are people who use grant funds to purchase them and then maybe aren't using them in the way that the funder intended. So now they've restricted the technology they'll purchase. So they may fund a dedicated system in that case, for example. So just be very careful in reviewing those funding sources to make sure you have that necessary information and that it meets the need that your AAC user has. These are just a few examples of some grant programs that exist. These were all pediatric focused ones. I'll say there's many of them. Many of the adult focused ones are going to be diagnosis based. So you'll see them for ALS, for example, is a common one, things like that, where they'll have funds for assistive technology. Just take a look at the requirements if you need provider involvement, and usually, other than something that maybe is very specific, often they are not very lengthy requirements. Another option that exists are financial loans. So today I'm going to be talking about the New Horizon Loan Program, which is the loan program that we have here in Florida, and what their requirements look like as an AT loan source. So when or why you might want to consider a loan for your funding, one is that you may not have other funding available. Like I said, not all insurances cover it, not all schools agree with the need for what type of equipment might be necessary. The insurance may not cover that specific type. Timing, as I mentioned, it can be a very long time span to get insurance funding. There might be some savings here as opposed to doing everything straight out of pocket, or you may just prefer to use this option as compared to those other sources. It may be less expensive than some other options or less cumbersome in terms of the paperwork process. You may have limited cash resources in terms of a down payment. So instead of doing something with just straight private funds, this could be a viable option. Our direct loan program here, there is an online application through FAAST and a PDF application available. You can also call and work with someone over the phone. FAAST themselves will underwrite the loan and make the decision on whether or not someone qualifies. And that's done through a loan committee that we have made up of FAAST Advisory Council members that provide those approvals. And the typical timeline for final decisions is 1 to 3 weeks. So again, this is a relatively quick process compared to some other funding mechanisms that are out there. The FAAST payments, the funds go directly to the AT provider, and they're then invoiced from FAAST. So specific details, these loans can be up to $25,000, and these are AT loans. So we're talking about AAC today, but this is really around assistive technology. So there are other items that can be purchased using these funds. No specific income requirements for this loan. The targeted minimum for the credit score is between 580 and 600. The target maximum debt to income ratio is 50% based on the gross income and debt. The current interest rate is 5.5%, but that does change or fluctuate with the market. And terms of the loan are 6 to 60 months. You can apply for both secured or unsecured loans. And this does apply to any type of assistive technology or service, including telework loans. And there are tiered credit requirements for certain loans over $15,000. So people have used these for things like modifying a van and other items as well. So those are the different funding sources I wanted to talk about today. All right, everybody, well, thank you for attending this afternoon. Please, if you haven't, check out FAAST.org for our other upcoming webinars, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.